Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, September 25th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of New Jersey and the governor's race, and a brand new poll out of Emerson College showing a tied race in a state that Kamala Harris won, Joe Biden won, Hillary Clinton won, Barack Obama won, John Kerry won, Al Gore won, Bill Clinton won, and so on and so forth. A Democratic state showing that in the 2025 year, in a year of consistent Democratic overperformances in numerous special elections, a year that is predating the 2026 midterms, which is largely expected to be a very good year for the Democratic Party, New Jersey is showing itself to be quite difficult for Democrats to lock in on a solid victory ahead of an election that's taking place in just about 40 days. Now, we've been covering the New Jersey race all year, as well as the Virginia race. When we initially started out, we knew that New Jersey and Virginia were likely going to be equally as competitive, but as the months have gone on, the New Jersey race is looking startlingly more competitive for the Democratic Party in comparison to the state of Virginia. Now, the Emerson College poll is one of many factors that has indicated that New Jersey has narrowed up. Don't get me wrong. I think Democrats are still on track for victory in the state of New Jersey, but to the degree that they are today seems less likely than it was a month ago. And that's not exactly where you want to be with 40 days to go. Now, thinking about what this New Jersey 2025 data is telling us, it's pretty simple. Jack Ciattarelli is at 43%, which is roughly the peak that Republicans have seen in the state, and Mikey Sherrill is at 43%, which is largely low in comparison to what it normally is. Amongst young voters, Mikey Sherrill takes a lead. Amongst middle-aged voters, she also takes a lead, and that makes sense. This is, in fact, a Democratic state. But when it comes down to the sheer amount of undecided voters, about 62% of this total 11% that is undecided are voters that voted for Kamala Harris in the last election. They're not Trump voters that are out here saying whether or not they're going to move over because they're unhappy with Donald Trump. The overwhelming majority of these undecided voters are voters that turned out to the ballot box and voted for Kamala Harris. Now, thinking about what the last election showed us about New Jersey is something very different than what it had seen in years past. New Jersey had been this state that had been reliable for the Democratic Party and had been called on poll closing on election night every single year. In fact, when you take a look at some of the margins here in the past, it actually might shock you just how much New Jersey really did narrow up in the 2024 cycle. At the beginning of the century, Democrats came off of Bill Clinton winning it. The last time it went to the GOP was in 1988 with George H.W. Bush. So since the 90s, New Jersey has been quite good for the Democrats, but primarily in 2000, it was Al Gore who won the state by 16. 4 years later, John Kerry won it by about 7 points here, and in 2008, Obama ushered in a 15-point victory, and in 2012, a 17-point victory. In 2016, we saw it narrow up slightly. Hillary Clinton won the state by 14. In 2020, Biden restored with a 16-point margin. But in 2024, it was the narrowest it had been for the Democrats since 1992, when Bill Clinton won the state by roughly 2 points. What New Jersey had showed was a massive, massive shift away from the Democratic Party, and especially in the areas surrounding New York City and its suburbs. It was this area in which that drove where Pennsylvania, the side that bordered Philly, really did not see that much shifting away from Kamala Harris and the Democrats in comparison to northern Jersey. And now seeing what this data is telling us, it is that the 2025 race is one that we knew would be more competitive than the state of Virginia, but now we are seeing it in an exceptionally close light. Now, Emerson College also is one of the few pollsters that have gotten things very right in the 2025 cycle. That's what I think should really be alarming for the Democrats in this point, because they've been trouncing the Republicans in every regard, right? Arizona's 7th district, Virginia's 11th district, Florida's 1st district, Florida's 6th district, Iowa's 1st Senate district, the Georgia State Senate race from Tuesday, all of these different races, at every point save 2 elections, and Washington. The Democrats have consistently outperformed in special election after special election, but New Jersey really seems to be holding them back. Now, Mikey Sherrill is an incumbent congresswoman who has outpaced Kamala Harris in the past. She comes from a swing district, not as much of a swing, but maybe on the presidential level. New Jersey's 11th district. When you take a look at the race here, let's go ahead and jump over and see how it voted on the presidential level. Kamala Harris only won the state by roughly 8. Won the district by roughly 8, right? And Andy Kim, who was elected to the U.S. Senate, won the district by roughly 10 points. So Mikey Sherrill was able to win here by roughly 15. So she had a track record of outpacing Kamala Harris, outperforming Republicans, with the Republican nominee doing significantly worse than Donald Trump. She had a record to run on and prove in 2025 that she could not only win, but outpace Kamala Harris. But now that seems increasingly less likely that the New Jersey governor's race is going to be as locked in for Democrats as they would have hoped. Obviously, when 62% of these undecided voters voted for Kamala Harris, you aren't exactly in a bad place. There certainly is room to grow for Mikey Sherrill, whereas for Jack Ciattarelli, it's a bit more difficult to see his pathway to the governorship, but he should absolutely not be counted out. If there was any shock race of the 2025 cycle, it would be New Jersey, a Democratic state that ultimately ends up electing a Republican for governor, and, ends up being this state that defies the expectations. And don't get me wrong, right? We've seen this happen in Republican wave years in 2022. We can actually look at some of those governor elections that cycle. A lot of these races really don't make sense given that Biden was down 10 points nationwide. Republicans won the national popular vote, and yet somehow Democrats are winning the election in Kansas, right? They won that race by 2.2% against Derek Schmidt, who's now in Congress because, he took Jake LaTurner's seat in Kansas. But again, that was the race that was meant to be more solid for the GOP. Trump had won the state by double digits, 15 points plus, 2016, 2020, and 2024. In 2022, there was all the speculation. Laura Kelly's out. Derek Schmidt was leading in the polls, X, Y, and Z. And guess what happened? It didn't happen. But it didn't mean that Republicans didn't win the House. It didn't mean that Republicans weren't able to take, more solid victories in states like Georgia when Brian Kemp ran against Stacey Abrams again, despite Biden winning the state in 2020. But what it did tell us a bit was about the candidate quality mattered. And that in this state in particular, because it was a governor election and not a Senate race, not a House race, the national stakes were far lower for the voters in that election, and they weren't as compelled to vote against the Democratic Party simply because they were unhappy with President Biden. And that's similar to here. Jack Ciattarelli might be someone who is supported by the Trump wing of the Republican Party, but to the point that he is seen as this extension of Donald Trump, Democrats have not successfully made that case to the voters in this state. And Mikey Sherrill, who I do think will ultimately win this governor election, is in a more competitive position because Jersey is one of those states where you've actually seen historically in the governor races, Democrats have constantly underperformed relative to their presidential margins. In 2017, this is the one that I point out all the time, Virginia went to Ralph Northam by 8.9%. Hillary Clinton won the state by 4.5%. So an outperformance here, or 5.4%. An outperformance here was one that was obviously or 4.9%. I'm losing the margin here, but I promise you, Hillary Clinton won the state less than Ralph Northam did, and that makes sense. Right, a year into Donald Trump, he's exceptionally unpopular. Voters are angry, and they turn on the incumbent president. Proximity to Washington, D.C., they vote against Ed Gillespie and vote for the Democrat. But in New Jersey, a state that Hillary Clinton won by roughly 15 points, only goes to Phil Murphy by 14 against the incumbent lieutenant governor, who's plagued by a governor, Chris Christie, who has an approval rating of shy of 10% across the state. And yet the lieutenant governor still comes within 15 points. Now, obviously, 14 points is a good margin. But what it also told us, too, was that 4 years later, Phil Murphy was not going to be in an amazing position. Because 4 years later, he almost lost the race. Phil Murphy only won by 3.2% when nobody was tracking the race, and now everybody is tracking the race. And the data also, to be a little bit more alarming here, for the Democrats, Phil Murphy was ahead by 6 in the final poll from Emerson. Well, their most recent poll, the one we're covering today, says it's a tie. If we were to base it on the 2021 numbers, the Emerson poll is suggesting that Ciattarelli might be ahead and ahead by a lot. But I obviously don't believe that is the case when you take a look at the average here, right? Mikey Sherrill, for the first time, actually, this Emerson College poll really weighs it down, is leading by less than Abigail Spanberger on average, and I think we are closer to what this average is saying, that she wins by 6, maybe 5 points. I don't think she loses the race, but it shows that this race isn't as locked in, right? The type of candidate you run matters. I'm not saying Mikey Sherrill is a bad candidate, but what I am saying is that when it comes down to how Republicans have run this campaign, Jack Ciattarelli reminds me a lot, believe it or not, of how Glenn Youngkin ran his campaign. The national environment, unfortunately for Ciattarelli, who ran in 2021, and I arguably do think ran a different campaign back then than the one he's running right now, because he knows there's a real possibility of victory. But I think he's running a more measured campaign, a stylized an approach that feels very much avoidance of talking about Trump too much and hammering in on the issues that matter most to voters in New Jersey. I think Mikey Sherrill is right in the way that she approaches a lot of this campaign, that voters are angry with Donald Trump, but a governor election is often very different than that of a more nationalized race like her own House bids, because oftentimes these congressional elections are not immediately translatable into performance in a gubernatorial race. Because what matters to your constituents, to Washington, D.C., when you fly down every other week versus what matters to them in the state's, governor's mansion and in the state house, these things can often be disconnected from one another. And I think the problem here is that Mikey Sherrill on paper, phenomenal candidate. When it comes down to actual dynamics of the election, it's a much more difficult thing to actually push that out to the voters. But I will say, I still think the Democrats are going to win this race. For what it's worth, it is one that just is worth more, more of a raising of alarm bells, because Jersey should not be this competitive by any metric. A state that Kamala Harris won, that Biden won, Clinton won, even the other Clinton won. You are talking about a state that is blue through and through, and yet somehow the Republicans are pulling ahead to now they are tied, according to Emerson College. Now, the other polls, too, and ones that arguably, in theory, know the state a little bit better, Quinnipiac University, based out of New Jersey, showing that Mikey Sherrill is ahead by 9. Qantas Insights has her ahead by 10. And these are all polls that are done within the same 3-week span. I do believe, though, that races have the opportunity to narrow up. Jack Ciattarelli's own internals had him down, and the most recent one has him up by roughly a point. So when you think about how the trend line is going, it's not phenomenal for Democrats, but they could very much hold on to the next 40 days. Now, the political betting markets have also been responding to what we've seen in terms of the drop here for Mikey Sherrill. Right, just a few days ago, she was at nearly a 90% chance of victory. Today, that has dropped down to roughly 80%. But this is the way these things go. And if the Democrats don't turn something around soon, we could reach an election day where, if this trend line continues day in and day out, being generous to the Republicans, you could reach a point where you're at 40 to 45% chance for the GOP. Realistically, a 30 to 35% chance. But a 1 in 3 chance of victory is exactly what Trump had in the 2016 election. And that was an upset. And this could be one too. So keep your eyes peeled on New Jersey as a state where we're not getting that much substantive data, but very real and reputable pollsters like Emerson College are coming out and raising the alarm bells too, because they are telling us exactly what we need to know, that this race is far more competitive than people realize. And again, a lot of that makes sense. When you look at the broken down crosstabs too, you'll start to see exactly why it is that Mikey Sherrill is not leading by more, why she's not in this position where she's, blowing out of the water. And that's because when it comes down to how women are voting in the state, she's only winning them by 10. And not even 50% of the vote there. There's still a lot of undecided. 15% of women are undecided. Just 6% of men are undecided. And Ciattarelli wins those men by 12 points. Phil Murphy's approval rating, down 5 points since May of 2025. He's at just a 35% approval rating. Not a great place to be, as the incumbent Democrat does not give voters, a good reputation for Democratic governance in the state. That also might be leading some of the hesitation. And thinking about, too, when Democrats think about their voting basis and what drives in Democratic vote share, you often have to think about minority voters, too, in specific. And specific to New Jersey, black voters make up a huge portion of the Democratic Party's voting electorate. 18% of black voters right now are undecided. That's not where you want to be, right? Kamala Harris won black voters 90 to 10, right? Obama, Biden won black voters 91 to 9. If Mikey Sherrill's in a position where, sure, she's winning 78% of black voters, but let's say Ciattarelli wins the rest of the undecided voters, that's enough on the margins that, compounded with factors of how white voters are going to vote, how we've already started to see shifts amongst Latino and Asian voters in the state from the last cycle, thinking about what we've seen amongst young voters and men in particular, there is a recipe here. There is a pathway here for Republicans to win the governor election, and it's not super difficult to see. It's not the likeliest outcome, but it absolutely is something that Democrats should keep in mind as a possibility that in the midst of all of these victories, one of these races might slip through. In New Jersey, just might be that race. No guarantee that it happens, but there's no guarantee they win either. So I'd encourage you to pay attention to New Jersey, take a look at who's running, what's happening on both sides, because as of now, Emerson College is telling us what I think a lot of Democrats really don't want to hear, which is that one of their races is far more competitive than it should be. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2025 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all